Okay. All right. Cameron English is our guest speaker today. Cameron actually recently appeared on an episode of the Dr. Phil show talking about fat shaming. And he just wrote his second piece for a second UK think tank. So he's becoming pretty popular out there in across the pond, as they say. So I will go ahead and turn this over to Cameron. Go ahead, Cameron.
All right. Thank you, Tom. It's nice to see all of you again. It's been a little while. Hope everybody's been well. So today I wanted to talk about processed food. And more specifically, I want to talk about the supposed dangers that come along with processed food, and particularly with ultra processed food, as it's pejoratively known in the media these days. I think this is largely overblown, the way this information is presented to the public. And I want to start actually with a film recommendation. About a decade ago, a filmmaker named Tom Naughton made a documentary called Fathead, and he shot it in response to Morgan Spurlock's film Super Size Me. So the idea was he's going to go on a fast food diet for 30 days, and he's going to follow the same rules. So he's going to eat 2,000 calories a day. He's going to eat everything on the menu at least once. But he had a third rule that Spurlock did, and he said, I have a functioning brain, so I am going to be a little more judicious about the choices that I make. And at the end of this experiment, I predict I will have lost weight and improved my health. So I highly recommend you watch the film, but I am going to spoil the conclusion. At the end of this experiment, it was 28 days. He had lost 12 pounds. He had reduced his body fat, and he's in his doctor's office, and his doctor is just dumbfounded. And he says, I don't like what you're proving here. And his doctor says, I think you've proved your point that it's not just avoid fast food. There's a little more to nutrition than that. And then Tom, at the very end of the film, he says, the other thing I wanted to stress is that if fast food is addictive, it's a really bad addiction, because after a month of eating it, I didn't eat it for 6 months. I just couldn't stand the sight of a McDonald's. So my point of bringing this up is to say, the way we talk about processed food, it's largely nonsense. It's driven more by ideology than by science. And I want to address a handful of specific points. So I want to deal with a handful of critical issues. These are constantly in the media. They're constantly in the peer-reviewed literature as well. So first and foremost, processed food isn't necessarily harmful. And in fact, I think when you look carefully at the science, what you see is that processing is a very poor metric for nutrition. I want to talk a little bit about this idea that processed food is addictive. I think that's just an awful hypothesis that's not been substantiated. And then I want to talk about the fact there's a lot of unprocessed foods that are, if they're overconsumed, they're unhealthy and even potentially dangerous in some cases. And then I'm going to wrap up with a brief discussion of food snobbery, because I think this is really what this whole campaign is rooted in. It's not rooted in science. It's rooted in these sort of ideological presuppositions. So let's take these in turn, starting with the idea that processed food is uniquely harmful. So before we get into it, I want to give a definition of processed food, just so we're clear on the terms we're using. So this is from a very well-known chef and a science writer. His name's Anthony Warner. He blogs under the name The Angry Chef. And I really love his work because he's very critical of Michael Pollan and some of these other pop food writers and these weird ideas that they propagate. It's very thoughtful, very science-based commentary. So he says, processed foods are broadly defined as any food that has undergone a process to alter its flavor, composition, or shelf life. Now, my commentary is that's just about everything, right? Unless you're going out into the woods and picking berries off a bush and hunting a deer and eating it right there on the spot, you're eating processed food. Now, the system that's most commonly used to rate the processing of different foods, it's called the NOVA classification system. Some of you are probably familiar with this, but there's 4 basic categories. There's unprocessed and minimally processed foods. There's processed culinary ingredients. So this would be like noodles and butter, these types of items. And then there's processed foods. And then the granddaddy, the double plus super bad, is ultra processed foods. Now, this classification system seems to make sense in the abstract, right? The more modification that you make to a particular ingredient or a particular item, the more processed it is. The problem is nobody actually agrees on which foods count as processed. So I have in mind here a 2021 study. They looked at 470 publications, and they found that all of these articles, these are journal articles and media articles, they had 146 different definitions of processed foods. So even when they're working from this same sort of a scale, right, the more processing, the more processed the food is, that kind of thing, they don't agree on it. And so the important point is, if you can't give me some sort of a semi-objective standard of what processing is, then you really can't use it as a metric for nutrition. So here's the conclusion from the authors of this 2021 paper. They say, from the perspective of food science and technology, processing and nutritional value do not have a linear relationship, and these concepts need to be disassociated. Perfectly said. I think that's about as clear as I've seen writing in an academic journal before. But it's absolutely the case. And let me give you just a couple of examples. So according to the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, deli meat, granola, and crackers are heavily processed. Now, if you look at these foods in terms of the nutritional content, there's nothing harmful about this. If you think about, say, 2 ounces of turkey or salami or something, right? This is the foundation for lunch. It's got a good balance of fat and protein. There's not very much sugar in it, and there's a healthy amount of micronutrients that you need in these foods. Same thing with granola and crackers, right? You have more carbohydrate, less fat, a little bit less protein. Perfectly acceptable for breakfast, or eight Ritz crackers with an ounce of cheese or something. Totally fine as a snack, right? These are perfectly acceptable foods to be part of a balanced diet. But when you look at the flip side and you look at some of the quote unquote unprocessed foods, you see things that can be potentially unhealthy if you overconsume them. So these are all based on the NOVA system. So under unprocessed and minimally processed foods, they have dried fruit, nuts, fruit juice with no added sugar. And then in the next category, processed culinary ingredients, they have honey extracted from honeycomb, molasses from cane or beets. So if you think about any of these, especially the sweeteners, it's very easy to overconsume these. And there's been research done on these, and what they show is that if people eat too much beet sugar or too much molasses or too much maple syrup or whatever, as natural as these are, they will increase your risk for diabetes. They will probably make you fat. They'll increase your risk for metabolic syndrome. So all of the harms are still there, whether or not the food is processed or not. And the same thing for dried fruit or nuts. These are great snacks. I have no problem with them. But my wife, sometimes she'll buy dried fruit. I just can't touch it because it's delicious and I can overeat it without even thinking about it. So all I'm saying, and I'm going to use moderation over and over again. I'm just going to warn you in advance, right? All of this stuff, if you overeat it, can do damage to you, metabolically speaking. So you just have to be a little self-aware and a little thoughtful about what you're eating. This processing scale, it's not going to do much for you in terms of trying to maintain a healthy weight or eat a balanced diet. Now, a lot of people will come back. Actually, let me give you one more example. I'm sorry. And I'm going to share my screen here because I want to talk about milk. Typical milk that you find in the grocery store, it's not considered a heavily processed food. When you think about the steps that it has to go through, it's quite heavily processed. So let me just show you this graph here. You guys see this? It's a little flow chart. You should be able to see that.
Yes, we do.
Okay. So depending on the milk product, these are the various stages of processing that the different items have to go through. So from the time it leaves the cow to the time it gets to your grocery store, these are all the things. And this comes from a 2019 paper on what the modern dairy industry looks like. So you can see from this sort of an overview, but of course, you have pasteurization, homogenization. The whole time this process is going, you have to have a maintained temperature, right? You can't let it get too hot. And then, of course, for that, you need refrigeration. Of course, you have automated milking operations now. You have veterinary care for the animals. You have all sorts of quality control testing going on. Now, you're not adding anything to the product, strictly speaking, in these cases, but just to get milk from a dairy to you, there's a tremendous amount of processing involved, right? And of course, this is a good thing. This doesn't make the product itself better or worse for you. And in fact, the American Academy of Pediatrics, as I'm sure most of you are aware, they recommend giving children ages 1 year and older milk, right? It's supposed to be a primary part of their diet. The fact that it's gone through all of these stages actually makes it safer. Now, in contrast, the AAP says, don't give your kids raw milk, because you can make them very sick. And in rare cases, people have died from consuming raw milk because there's all kinds of microbes in it. There's much less quality control. So it can be very, very dangerous. So again, this just underscores the fact that processing serves a very important role. You could make the same argument for canning and various processes that are meant to preserve food, so it stays on the shelf and doesn't make people sick. Now, the opponents of processed food, they'll come back inevitably at this argument, and they'll say, well, obviously we have no problem with milk and we have no problem with almonds, right? What we're really concerned about is the double plus bad ultra processed food. These are things that these are largely industrial products. They'll say they have 4 or 5 added ingredients. They have this perfect mixture of sugar, salt, and fat. So it hits that bliss point. So people get this massive dopamine hit and they just keep coming back and they can't stop eating potato chips because they're addictive. And this is what we're really upset about. I have so many problems with this argument. I really don't know where to start, but let's begin here. We don't use this standard for any other product or service, So as I mentioned in a previous one of these, I bought a Toyota last year, and the primary reason we bought it is because it's got a great crash test rating, and I have a young son who I need to transport. It's got plenty of leg room. It's got storage room. It's got a great sound system. It's got climate control. It's all the features that a young family would want. Now, no one says, those bastards at Toyota, they're making cars that the driving public wants to buy. These are perfectly engineered automobiles, and that's over the line. I think everybody rightly understands that that's foolish. Of course, companies make products that their customers want. You can think same thing with music, same thing with movies, same thing with cell phones, right? The features continually improve until they reach a point where the consumer is happy and they will keep buying the product. It's the same thing with food, right? Most food products fail. So the ones that end up on your shelves are the ones that stay there because people will buy them. There's nothing conspiratorial about this. There's nothing malevolent about it. It's that these companies are trying to figure out which products consumers will buy. It's as simple as that. So there's nothing scandalous about that, I would stress. But if you look at just some of the evidence around these foods, and this will probably get me in trouble when this goes up on YouTube. I really don't care. There's nothing wrong with having a Pop-Tart every once in a while, or having a bag of chips, or eating this food. I think we all inherently recognize that McDonald's French fries shouldn't be the foundation of your diet. That's right. That's not what I'm here to argue. Nonetheless, if you're getting around the table with your family or your friends and you're eating maybe too much, or you're eating certain foods that are not good to eat routinely, that's okay, right? There's social bonding going on. There's a lot of benefit in that. And the fact that you're eating food that's more pleasurable than it is nutritious, it's okay, right? For an occasional event, not a big deal. And here's another thing. I'm sure you guys remember the Twinkie diet from 2010. We had this professor of nutrition at Kansas State. His name was Mark Halb. And he went on the Twinkie diet, as the media called it. So he was eating cupcakes and cookies and Twinkies and candy, things that most people would say this is junk food. And he lost 27 pounds on this diet because he limited his intake to 1,800 calories. And his point was to say, you just have to be judicious about how much you eat. That's really all it comes down to. Now, a lot of his critics came out and they said, well, you've taken funding from Coca-Cola, so we don't trust your results. And he said, well, what is there not to trust? This is what I weighed before. This is what I weigh now. Here's my food log, So he reversed the experiment and he ate a balanced diet that was built around salads, but he ate as much as he wanted. and he gained 17 pounds. So this, I think what this clearly illustrates is that there's no magic food. There's no particularly demonic or evil food. It just takes a little bit of moderation. And there's that word. It's a very unsexy word. No one likes to hear that. I think Aristotle was right 2,300 years ago. Moderation is all it takes. Now, the food addiction folks will come back and they'll say, well, we have these animal models, and they show that rats become addicted to sugary chow, right? And when we give them chow that has this mix of salt and sugar and fat, they get addicted to it. So this lends support to the food addiction hypothesis. Now, what they typically won't stress is that these are very artificial conditions, and they give the animals restricted access to this chow. And then when they eat it, there's some sort of penalty involved. So they'll shock the rodents on their feet if they eat this stuff. And for whatever reason, this encourages them to eat more. So there's a couple things to say here. When you do these same experiments and you give them unrestricted access to this food, they lose interest in it, which I think is very, very striking. I don't know how that would translate to a human situation, but my suspicion is that when people have access to stuff, and they're not told, don't eat this, it's bad for you, and we're going to tax this, and we're going to tell you how to live. It's time to eat bugs instead of meat, and all of this silliness that's in the news lately. It loses that sort of like, this is the naughty thing, this is the forbidden fruit. I think that might be part of the situation. But in any case, in these animal models, when you give them unrestricted access, when you don't, tase them for eating sugar, they lose interest in it. And then you also have on the human side, you have interesting research. There's been some studies done that show people develop odd eating habits. And I don't want to say addiction, I think that's the wrong word. But they habitually eat things that are not good, right? They're not delicious, they're not nutritious, they're not hyperpalatable, they're not processed. So for example, there's a show some years ago called Freaky Eaters. And one of the women on this show ate nothing but cornstarch. She would go to the grocery store, get a bag of cornstarch and just eat it by the spoonful, right? Now, I guess you could call cornstarch a processed food, I suppose, but it's not good, right? There's not an epidemic of people eating cornstarch. But nonetheless, the point is that people develop these odd eating habits, and it has nothing to do with the palatability of the food necessarily. And then you also have studies where researchers will take obese patients, they'll give them a drug like naltrexone, and you can significantly decrease their interest in hyperpalatable foods, but they don't lose weight. And the reason is they just shift their eating habits to other stuff. Maybe they go to lots of unprocessed food, but they're still overeating. Okay. And we can talk a lot more about this, but I think these are the sort of data points that, for one thing, you don't hear about in the media very often, but they really complicate the food addiction hypothesis. I guess you could say, well, these are exceptions to the rule, but I think they're too common for that to be the case. I think they go right to the heart of this hypothesis. And that's a real problem. So I've stressed some of this in my writing. I think it's important. So let me just briefly recap. I've thrown a bunch of information at you. I've thrown a bunch of references at you. And if you want to look at any of the research I'm citing, I'm happy to send that to you after the fact. But what we've seen here, processed food is not by default harmful. I think that's an assumption that's not justified. I think that the ultra processed foods are addictive. I don't think that's justified by the data. And of course, there's lots of unprocessed, non-GMO, organic, all natural stuff that is just as bad for you as anything that they tell you is harmful in terms of processed food. So, as I mentioned at the top, I think food snobbery is really what's driving this whole campaign. And here I'm pulling from a University of Michigan food scholar. Her name is S. Margot Finn. She wrote a great essay for the Breakthrough Institute in 2019. It's called Food Injustice. I don't agree with everything in there. I think there's some of her progressive politics leached into that. But I think on this point, she's 100% correct. So she points out that beginning in the 1980s, you had more people entering the middle class and the upper class. And so they have disposable income and they start spending it on all sorts of different things, including their food. And then at the same time, you have the industrialized food system, as it's pejoratively called, really exploding in terms of efficiency and productivity. So you have, following the Green Revolution in the middle of the 20th century, you have higher yielding crop varieties, you have increase in the use of synthetic pesticides and fertilizers. So crop yields are increasing. On the animal agriculture side, you have improvements in veterinary care, you have improved animal breeds that produce more meat and milk per animal. And then you have the technological improvements that keep the animals healthier, and so they produce more. So all of this contributes to widespread access to food at a lower price. And so if you're wealthy, food it's no longer about sustaining yourself, it's about an identity. And so here's what Finn writes about this. She says, middle and upper class people began to fixate on gourmet food, weight loss dieting, natural foods, and ethnic cuisines. Most of the shift in attitudes toward food was undertaken in the name of health and in the environment, but its primary function has been to enable people of a certain social class to distinguish themselves from the unwashed masses. Now, she gives several examples of this. She gives the example of Beto O'Rourke during his presidential campaign a few years ago. He was asked by a reporter, how do we tackle obesity and hunger? These are paradoxical issues, and they're constantly threatening a lot of Americans. And his answer was, well, we need to subsidize farm-to-table restaurants. And Finn says to this, she says, well, this is ridiculous. This is the answer of someone who lives in a bubble, who's disconnected from these problems, right? So she says, obviously, the reality is you need widespread access to nutritious food, but then you also just have to accept that people are not necessarily going to eat the way you want them to eat, right? Even if you're well-meaning, even if you're trying to get them to eat more all natural, all this stuff, whatever, they may not do it, and you have to be okay with that. And I think that's what a lot of this comes down to. And let me give you two more quotes, and then I'll stop talking, and then we can have a discussion. This first one is from Ashley Gerhardt. She's an associate professor of psychology at the University of Michigan. If you look at the food addiction literature, her name pops up very frequently. She's done a lot of work on this. But she says, it will likely take industry regulation to chip away at the popularity of ultra-processed foods and the health problems that come with them. And then one more, this is from Richard Hoffman. He's an associate lecturer in nutritional biochemistry at the University of Hertfordshire. And he says, simply reducing your intake of ultra-processed foods may be a challenge. Ultra-processed foods are designed to be hyper-palatable, and together with persuasive marketing, this can make resisting them an enormous challenge for some people. So as I alluded to earlier, I can't stand this mindset that's so prevalent among a lot of academics these days, particularly in public health and obesity research and tobacco control. These people just sort of take it upon themselves to say, stupid Rube, you don't have any self-control. I'm going to step in and make decisions for you. I'm going to tax the food that you want to eat. I'm going to redesign your built environment so you have to walk more. And I'm going to make sure there's more water fountains, and I'm going to tax soda, and I'm going to take vending machines at your kids' schools. Now, as we were talking about just before we started recording, none of this has worked, of course. And what they're saying is, well, we just need more of it. We need to double down more, right? But it's two things, right? It's this sort of condescending attitude. I think it's the sort of technocratic tinkering that F.A. Hayek really attacked in a lot of his work. These people, they don't have, and they can't possibly have the knowledge they need to plan everybody's diet, but they're so hubristic that they do it anyway. So that drives me bananas. But then, of course, the evidence is not on their side. There is not good evidence behind any of these ideas, but they persist. So I think ultimately the problem is something that the physicist Freeman Dyson pointed out in his book, The Scientist is Rebel. If you haven't read it, highly recommend it. But he says early on in the book that science is a mosaic of partial and conflicting visions. But there is one common element in these visions. The common element is rebellion against the restrictions imposed by the locally prevailing culture. So I think in a lot of scientific and public health issues, a lot of researchers have lost sight of this. They become apologists for the status quo, or they become, like the intellectual muscle behind certain popular ideas in public policy. And what they should be doing is they should be stress testing these ideas, So even if something is mainstream and it is valid, and it should be embraced. I think it's the job of scientists to say, okay, does the evidence really support this? Do we really need to hold on to this idea? That's what science does. And that's when society flourishes, is because you have sort of a check on the politicians and on the broader culture that sometimes does things that are silly, right? You need a rigorous check on these things. And I think as the food addiction and the processed food stuff shows, you have a lot of academics who are just not fulfilling that role. And so you get these, food is addicting, climate change causes heart attacks, men can get pregnant, all of these silly ideas that a lot of people take seriously today that obviously don't stand up to scrutiny. So ultimately, that's the issue we're facing. I'll stop there. Thank you all so much for your time. And then if you have questions, happy to talk.
Okay, roll it out to you guys. Any questions?
Yes, thank you, Cameron. I agree with nearly everything you say, not quite all, but still, we do have the problem of obesity. So what's your solution to that?
If I had a solution to that, I don't think I'd be talking to you guys. I'd live in a mansion somewhere, right? I would have produced the pill that treats it. I don't know that there is a good one. I think the mistake we've made is trying to treat it as a policy issue. In my experience, because I was obese as a kid, what worked for me was support from my family, and it was good nutrition advice from sources I trusted. And I think you have to tackle it on that level, So when the CDC comes out and they say, we're going to combat, food injustice, and we're going to combat food deserts, it's like these are these broad policy responses that really can't do anything, because what you have to get at is, why do people eat these foods? Why do they make the choices they make? And I just don't think that can be solved. So I honestly don't think I have a good answer. I think there are some drugs that are coming onto the market that are supposed to help with weight loss. I think those might make a dent in it, but I think there isn't a perfect solution to obesity.
Okay, can I have one more question?
Sure.
Yeah.
And I agree. I agree with you. I don't think there's such a thing as food addiction, but clearly there's alcohol addiction and tobacco addiction. And I think I looked into the relationship between taxation and alcohol use over the last 250 years. And I think, to me, there's a very clear relationship between the amount of alcohol that's drunk and the amount of tax. Starting in the 17th century, when you could buy a pint of gin for a penny or something, and thousands of people were getting drunk and becoming alcoholics, and they put a tax on it, and it reduced it greatly. And I think that's continued since.
So do you think the same thing might work with obesity and certain foods? Or?
No, I don't. I don't, because I don't think there's a specific food. And as you say, the foods that people are eating are the tastiest often, and in general are pretty nutritious. I mean, I think it's eating too much of the wrong things or eating too much of them rather than eating them at all is the problem.
Sure.
The other problem with that is that you're punishing those people who are consuming the products moderately, while you're trying to go after the people that are supposedly abusing the products.
Yeah, that's in a way what I'm saying too.
Good point. I have a question and a comment. First of all, did you define ultra processing, or did you say it's indefinable?
I gave the definition that they use, and I think my point was that it's not definable as a measure of nutritional quality. But I think, and I can bring up the exact NOVA classification if you want specifically what they call it here. If you give me just a second. So yeah. I believe it's
are impossible foods ultra processed. That's another good question.
Yeah, good question. Absolutely, I would say. Okay. Okay.
That question comes from my friend Alice here listening in. She's my foodie friend
You
and
should,
not
Yeah.
a fattest.
you should see the
Okay,
processes that Impossible has to go through to create their products.
Okay, so here's the specific definition. So ultra processed foods are industrial formulations made entirely or mostly from substances extracted from food, oils, fats, sugar, starch, proteins, derived from food constituents, so hydrogenated fats, modified starch, synthesized in laboratories, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so my take on this is that, these are, right, you don't find Twinkies on a tree. Obviously not. But I think this all sort of misses the point, because this is all stuff that your body recognizes and you can metabolize. And again, as Nigel was saying, it's overconsumption. That's the problem, right? So they have a definition here, but I just don't think it makes sense. And let me give you a couple.
Okay. Now I want to comment about the Twinkie diet. You cited a guy at Kansas State. I'd love to look up his academic heritage and see if he was trained by our Paul Saltman. Paul Saltman, distinguished biochemist here at UC San Diego. He came to us from USC. He had a lot of expertise in other areas, but he taught a very popular course called the Biochemistry of Nutrition. And he taught it not only for chem majors, but also for non-science majors. And he used the Twinkie as his subject. And of course, his bottom line was a Twinkie. There's no such thing as junk food. A Twinkie, when you boil it all down, is protein, fat, and carbohydrate. And in the lab, they would do that. They would process the Twinkie. He said, try to find me some poisonous substances. And of course, they couldn't even pick up the minute amounts of preservative in the Twinkie. Well, he was rewarded by his graduate students one year because somebody went out and bronzed a Twinkie, and it sat prominently on his desk, a bronze Twinkie. Now, don't think that Paul had a long-term impact, because the largest Whole Foods in our area is immediately adjacent to the UC San Diego campus. I don't need to tell any of you that our scientific record here is incomparable, but yet if you want to see a lot of colleagues and a lot of graduate students, go in the Whole Foods store. They love that store. They give it a lot of business. I give it as little business as I possibly can.
Yeah, I think the feeling is mutual. Let me make one comment before we go on. I'm sure you guys remember Walter Kempner at Duke University. If not, he had this rice diet that he would put people on where, right, they were taking in like 250 to 300 grams of rice. They were drinking fruit juice. They were drinking or consuming just granulated white sugar. They weren't allowed any vegetables. They weren't allowed any meats. And people lost an absurd amount of weight. I mean, he had probably hundreds of people lose more than 100 pounds. Now, if you ask any dietitian today, any nutritionist, any food writer, they would all say, this is preposterous. You can't eat like this. And they did, absolutely, right? Because it came down to caloric intake, but then also like the actual process of eating. Rice is very filling, it's bulking. So people lost weight on this. And I think looking at that really sort of redirected my thinking. I said, oh, okay, this makes sense. This good food, bad food, eat this, not that sort of charade is just that.
Green. What about Michael Pollan?
Oh, Pollan.
I didn't know that.
About Michael Pollan.
Yeah, I don't know. I want to be polite here. Some of the things, eat plants or eat food, mostly plants, eat real food. I think this sort of runs up against the science that we're talking about here. These are popular ideas. They're easy to digest for the public, but there's not a lot of science behind them. I think, I talked about these, it's relatively wealthy upper class people who like all natural food. Pollen is the reading material for that crowd, I think.
Well, it's also the super poor.
All right. So do you think that there's food that is inflammatory or anti-inflammatory?
Good question.
Yes. What about that?
You know, I mean, not to use the cliches, but the dose makes the poison, right?
Right.
So I think it depends. You know, I've seen research where it's overeating that causes inflammation. You know, as people gain weight, they experience more inflammation, which can increase their risk for metabolic disease, you know, metabolic syndrome and so forth. So I don't know. I mean, some foods are certainly, right. And is it a good idea to live on cornstarch? Right. Obviously, obviously not. But I think it's all about balance, and it really comes down to quantity ultimately. And I think it's going to vary from person to person. You know, if someone's diabetic, they're going to talk to their physician, and what they need is going to be a little bit different than what someone like myself needs, or what any one of you need, you know.
Well, that's the reason why some diets work for some people and not others.
Yeah.
We all have different metabolisms.
Cameron, this is the 40th anniversary of the founding of the Obesity Society. Did you all hear that? Is my mic working?
Yes,
Yeah.
it is.
So I want to make a few points. First of all, that society has about 3,000 members, and they're meeting next week. And I'm going to it. And I'm going to it because I was the first president of it 40 years ago. And I went into the field of obesity because I did not think it would be solved in my lifetime. And so far, that's been utterly, completely true. There has not been a single breakthrough. I was having dinner in 1997 with Jeff Friedman, and he told me, I've got this great thing. It's a hormone, and I'm going to call it leptin. And he said, I said, why? He said, because it's after the Latin word thin. And he said, it's going to be a great anti-obesity agent. And I said, well, that's interesting, but maybe you shouldn't name it until you get it tried out. And he's a good friend, by the way, so I could be blunt with him. It was just the two of us at dinner. And my prediction proved completely true. That is, leptin is not an anti-obesity agent unless you happen to have a very, very rare defect in either the leptin receptor or the production of leptin. So no, we haven't solved it. In fact, we don't have not a single agent that's really effective. The newest one out, I think it's zertepetide. Let me get it right. Zerpeptide. I'm not even pronouncing it right. You can look that up. Zertepetide. Anyhow, it was announced on June 3rd at the American Diabetes Association. And it appears, and I emphasize the word appears, it appears that it actually does have a significant and sustaining weight loss effect, and without any negative consequences. If that proves to be true, and depending on how long you take it and how much you lose and whether it keeps going, it's interesting. Obviously, this is the first announcement of the FDA approval of it, June 3rd. And so we've got a long way to go before we know about its real safety and efficacy for different kinds of people. But my real point is to emphasize that there is no known solution to obesity. The most effective solution to obesity today is metabolic surgery, as they now call it, gastric bypass, as they used to call it. It's fantastic. It's wonderful. People lose weight. Most of them regain it within 10 years, sometimes within 2 or 3 years. But it's really the only effective method for getting rid of large amounts of weight. How many saw the the Biggest Loser, the television program?
Yes, of course.
Well, some didn't. It was a program in which people lost a lot of weight, really a lot, like sometimes 200 pounds. Every one of them regained. every one of them. So I'm putting an explanation point on what Cameron said. We really don't know. We don't understand the body regulatory mechanisms. Excuse me, I don't have any water here. We don't understand why some people get fat and some don't on the same diet. Some get fat and some don't on the same exact diet. I did a study of one of those ultra processed foods back about 20 years ago. You will know it as Ensure. E-N-S-U-R-E. E-N-S-U-R-E is the most common diet used for people who must be fed by a liquid diet, a tube in the stomach, or by drinking it, either way. It's a fantastic diet. No one develops any deficiencies with it. It does not have any lactose, so they don't get any diarrhea, and they can live on it forever on nothing but that canned liquid diet. So I think there can't be anything more processed than a canned liquid diet. And especially when you're taking nothing but that canned liquid diet. So I guess my point is, we're all wishing there was a magic bullet. We're all wishing there was an answer to overeating or undereating, for that matter. And God gave us a very, very good regulatory system for body weight. It's different for all of us. I use with my medical students right now, I say, now, I want you to sit there and raise your temperature 1 degree. Okay, couldn't do it, huh? Okay, now don't move. Now lower your temperature 1 degree or 2 degrees. Food intake regulation is just as good as temperature regulation. It's fantastically positive, strong, effective. It is, the problem is we don't all have the same system. And so people who have a regulatory system around a higher level of fat or a lower level of fat, or who are more persuaded by advertisements and by logic and sense, can regulate on a whole lot of different things. But we are highly regulated in our food intake. And I'm betting, looking at Jack, Tom, Nigel on this video, that none of you do much control your weight. I'm guessing.
We try.
I actually was advised by my doctor in 2017 that I had to lose weight. I was up to 205 pounds. And so I started walking every day and working out at the gym. And so I kept my dietary caloric intake the same, but I added more exercise to my routine. So I was burning more calories. So it meant for an overall weight loss. And I'm fluctuating between 180 and 190. And he said that's safe.
Well, that's a good round. That's just fine. I will tell you this, that exercise without any calorie restriction will be immediately compensated by calorie intake. So you had to have at least been restraining your calorie intake to not increase it in response to the exercise.
I didn't have a problem maintaining the diet the way it was. I never eat breakfast, so that stayed the same, leaving that out. And I only eat lunch about once every other day. So it's just dinner I focus on.
Yeah.
I do my regulating primarily by portion control and finding alternate exercises that don't bother my very bad knees. But I want to comment on the gastric bypass. You've taken me back in memory to my early years of surgical training, which was general surgery first. And those were days a long, long time ago when they were experimenting with different kinds of bypass procedures. And I remember one vividly when they were putting clips on the distal end of the esophagus and saying, well, that fixes that. Now let's see him regain the weight. And we had a patient who within a very few months regained all the weight simply by melting his ice cream before he took it. and ate as much ice cream as he could possibly put in there. So much for the problem of regaining weight after all kinds of bypass. By the way, those were the days of total parenteral nutrition. Can you give somebody who is very, very sick for a wide variety of reasons all they need by intravenous? And the complication to that was diarrhea. And I'm wondering if a straight diet of Ensure might have altered the elimination process. I don't know whether it does or not.
Well, I think you're right, and it does. I can tell you that. I was at the University of Pennsylvania when the very first parenteral nutrition feedings were
That's
done.
where they did it. Yes, at Penn.
Yes, yes, and that's where I was at the time they were doing the initial research on dogs. And I myself have published in the first issue of the Journal of Parenteral and Enteral Nutrition.
Ah,
And
who
it
was
was
the
on
surgeon in charge of that? I can't think of his name. Who was the surgeon on your team?
let me think a second.
Yeah.
I'll think of it. I'll think about it as soon as we hang up. But yes, he was there. And there's no doubt we've made huge improvements on and have an amazing ability to make parenteral nutritions that can save lives.
Yeah.
And there are people with no GI tract or missing major parts of their GI tract who really need parenteral nutrition.
Mhm.
And we have shown that it's perfectly possible with very good care
Mhm.
to maintain health with parenteral nutrition. Parenteral means it's all intravenous.
Right.
It all has to have very, very high standards. And you wouldn't want to do that to yourself unless you had no other alternative.
Right.
Dr. Hanson,
So
the drug
if
we're
we-
talking about is semaglutide. The brand name that was approved by the FDA was called Wegovy.
Yeah, no, that's not
That's
the one
not
that
it?
came out in June, but yes.
This is June
semaglutide
4th
fine.
of, I'm sorry, this is June 4th of last year.
Yep.
So that's a different one.
I think it's tirzepatide. Let me see, here it is. Tirzepatide. Tirzepatide. That's what I couldn't pronounce. And it was approved by the FDA in June, this June, for the first time.
Okay.
So that keep an eye on that one. It's going to have to, it's going to have to be more research before we can really recommend it. But it's a good, it may be a useful adjunct to cutting back calories, but cutting back calories is not simple because we have a good regulatory system, as I tried to make with the temperature analogy. It's a very good one.
So
otherwise we'd all be elephants.
we have this good regulatory system. Why has there been such an increase in obesity?
Oh, that was an easy one.
Good.
I was in sub-Saharan Africa. And in sub-Saharan Africa, there are no obese people outside the cities. There are obese people when they come into the cities of Cote d'Ivoire and Mali, but not outside the cities. And they are literally on subsistence living. That's the answer to that question.
Wow.
If you take the lid off, as we have done in most of the major cities in the world, there's no longer a constraint on food. People will then regulate to the ability of their body. That is the preference of their body. And I consider that a regulatory mechanism issue.
Yeah, okay.
As was American society in 1900, mostly on subsistence feeding.
You got that right. Exactly. So
the problem-
we have taken that lid off in sub-Saharan Africa now, and their rate of obesity is going up. And guess what else is going up?
Their heights
Working their
also.
asses off in factories.
Type 2 diabetes.
Yeah.
They go hand in hand. They go up together, they go down together. And low weight people have very little, if any, type 2 diabetes. They may lose weight after they get the diabetes, but getting it is not going to happen when they're on a low calorie diet.
Yeah, but people on subsistence diet don't grow properly. So I measured 150 children in Algeria on the edge of the Sahara Desert, and their and percentiles were about along the 5th percentile of English children, because they had to poor diet.
Yeah, right. George Washington was unusually tall for his age because he grew up in an elitist family.
Yeah.
By the way, the name you were looking for was Stanley Dudrick.
Dudrick, that's it. Stan Dudrick, right.
Yep, he was there
remember
when I
him.
was there.
I remember him and I remember his talks at
Yeah,
meetings.
Good. Were you at Penn?
No.
Yeah.
But I had a lot of friends there, still do.
Well, they've always been very good in the whole area of appetite regulation, obesity, nutrition.
Anyone have anything else? Well, I thank Cameron and I thank all of you for participating, and look forward to something on next month. If you guys have any ideas what you'd like to talk about, just give me an email and I'll see if one of our experts is willing to tackle that issue.
Thank you.
Thanks again. Take care.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you all. Have a good
Thank you,
one.
Cameron.
Cameron.